All right. Well, thanks very much to Holly for inviting me to be a part of this online colloquium. My name is Tomas Bogardus, and I thought today I'd share a bit with you about a paper I'm working on about the ethics of pronouns. And right now the title is Peace Be Upon They, Them. All right, so the paper is divided into two parts. And in the first part, I talk about how we do, in fact, use third-person singular pronouns in English. So pronouns like he and she. And then in the second half of the paper, I think about the question of how we should use these pronouns. Okay, so I'll start with some words about how we do, in fact, use these pronouns, how English, in fact, evolved. And what I try to defend in this paper is a view that you might call the sex tracking view. So on this view, these pronouns evolved so as to communicate information about biological sex. And here's how Sally McConnell-Janae put it in 2020. She said, English speakers learn very early to use she and the rest of the paradigm, her, hers, and herself, for specific, individual, presumptively female reference, and he and him and his and himself whenever speaking of those we take to be male. So I just wanted to emphasize the take to be part and the presumptively part, because that'll be important in a second when I respond to an objection. So the view I want to defend is that when we use third person singular pronouns in English in the traditional way, in the usual way, in the ordinary way, these pronouns have what philosophers call a character, which is something like a program or a recipe or a protocol that helps the listener find the referent of the pronoun in the conversation. And so the program or the protocol or the recipe, when you hear a pronoun like he, is something like search through the conversational context and find the most salient male. That might be the referent of this pronoun. And similarly for she and her, we look for the most salient object, as Sally McConnell-Janae put it, taken to be female, similarly with males. Okay, so that's the sex tracking view, this character of these third-person singular pronouns encodes information about biological sex. Okay, so what are some reasons to think that this is in fact how English evolved? One reason is that we're quite comfortable using these pronouns with respect to non-human animals. So whatever gender is taken to be, as long as it's not just biological sex, if gender is something besides biological sex, if it's something like sex-typed social roles or some sort of psychological state that goes by the name of gender identity, if it's something like that, well, animals don't have that, right? But we're still very comfortable referring to animals as he and she. So that's some evidence in favor of the sex tracking view. Some other considerations is that it makes sense that languages would evolve to track biological sex. It's no surprise that we have words for the sexes like male and female, because if only because males are disproportionately violent. They commit a disproportionate number of crimes, especially violent crimes and sexual assault. So it makes sense that we would want to keep track of the males and the females, especially if we're interested in having sex segregated spaces, female-only spaces. Then it would make sense that we want to communicate information about biological sex to keep tabs on the males, as it were. Okay, another reason is that current birth rates notwithstanding, humans still have an interest in sexual reproduction. And so keeping track of biological sex in that way, even like using our pronouns, embedding the information in our pronouns would facilitate sexual reproduction. That's probably why humans evolved an extremely good ability to discern the sexes of other humans. We're extremely good at that, using cues like facial structure and gait and so on. Okay, so all the reasons why we would evolve to discern the sexes and our languages would evolve to label the sexes, those reasons are reasons why we might have encoded that information in the character of our pronouns. Okay, so in this paper, I deal with, I think, 4 objections to the sex tracking view. Here, in the interest of time, I'll just share one of them. This comes from Michael Glansberg and Cameron Domenico Kirk Giannini. That's one person. And the objection is, it's an objection to the sex tracking view, and the objection is, hey, look, if we were really tracking biological sex with these pronouns, then we should be extremely reluctant. We should think it's incorrect to apply the pronouns to non-biological entities, things like C-3PO, that android from Star Wars. We're quite comfortable describing him as him and using he, him pronouns for C-3PO, even though he has no biological sex. Similarly with the Statue of Liberty, Alexa, if you have an Alexa, or Siri, these things have no biological sex, but we're pretty comfortable using these third-person singular pronouns. They also point out that in English, it's at least customary to use she, her pronouns for ships, for watercraft. Okay, so that's the objection. Here's a response. So it's possible that what's going on here is not actually a semantic phenomenon. It doesn't have to do with the meaning of these pronouns. It could be that these pronouns do have the meaning that I said they do a minute ago, where the character does encode information of biological sex. That could be true. And yet we could use these pronouns of entities that have no biological sex, because what's happening is a pragmatic phenomenon. So it could be that we describe C-3PO using he and him pronouns. Like if I were to say C-3PO has been dismantled and now his head is near his own feet. So that happens in the movies. And it could be that what I literally said, the strict meaning of what I said, entails that C-3PO is male, which is false. So strictly speaking, what I said was false. But I could use that false statement to communicate an important truth. And maybe the truth is, in addition to telling you that C-3PO is dismantled and folded up, I'm also telling you by using the he, him pronouns that C-3PO has a sufficiently high number of characteristics in common with males. And so I'm sort of, it's kind of like a pretense. We're pretending that he's male. I'm communicating that information to you by using he, him pronouns. Similarly, with the Statue of Liberty, I mean, she straight up resembles a human female. And so it's natural that we would say, look at how she's holding the torch above her head. Strictly speaking, what we said was false because, I mean, she's not a person. She has no biological sex. But what we're communicating is something important, something like this statue represents a woman with a torch over her head. So this is not unprecedented. We do things like this in English pretty commonly. So for example, I might speak of a stone lion out in the courtyard. I'll say like, wow, I saw a beautiful stone lion out in the courtyard. Now, strictly speaking, what I said is impossible. There cannot be stone lions. Lions are biological entities. They cannot be made out of stone. But what I communicated through this pragmatic process is that there's a stone representation of a lion. Stone representation of a lion. There's a statue that resembles a lion. That's what I'm telling you. Similarly, if a server in a restaurant says to the manager, oh no, the ham sandwich left without pain. The ham sandwich left without pain. Then what's, strictly speaking, what's said is absurd. It sounds as though there was a ham sandwich that was a customer and left the restaurant without pain. But what's communicated with that false sentence is something like, the customer who ordered a ham sandwich left without pain. Okay, so what I'm suggesting is something similar might be happening with these pronouns, even if they do track biological sex. Okay, let's turn now to how we should use these pronouns. So I think that's a more important question, frankly. I think that's where the debate is really happening, because no matter how we in fact use the pronouns, whether we use them to track biological sex or not, a further question is, what should we do going forward, right? So even if we found out that we haven't been tracking biological sex all this time, it still might be the case that we should. Like, biological sex is really important. So let us henceforth use pronouns to communicate information about biological sex. Or, I mean, maybe you think the opposite's true. Maybe you think even if it's true that we are tracking biological sex with our third person singular pronouns, we should stop. That's problematic. So there are a lot of philosophers who think that on the other side of the debate. Okay, so let me now tell you why I think that, at least in my own case, and I invite you to agree with me about this, I don't think that we shouldn't change the way we in fact use these third person singular pronouns. I think we should continue to track biological sex. And so a couple of reasons are just rehearsing what I said before. All the reasons why, well, at least some of the reasons why English in fact evolved to track biological sex would be reasons that it still should. Namely, biological males are violent and dangerous. We should keep track of them. Sexual reproduction is an important part of the human experience. It's important for the propagation of the species. Tracking biological sex will facilitate this. And I wanted to connect with something that Holly said in her talk. So one of the doctrines on that list, that creed of the gender critical feminism creed, the agenda, as it were. One of them was the terms male and female should refer to sex. That was one of the items on that agenda. And if I were to imagine why that's the case, if I were to ask Holly, I think she would say something like, it helps to have language to name oppressed groups. If there's some oppression going on, and the group that's being oppressed doesn't even have a name for itself, then that's going to frustrate the consciousness raising process and the resistance to the oppression. So that's why I think gender critical feminists are so interested in preserving the word female, at least. Like woman, the word woman has become super contentious, but let's not lose female, at least, because it's important to name a group that is being oppressed on sex-marked grounds, being oppressed because of its sex. Okay, and that would presumably help that group organize and resist the oppression. Okay, so that's a third reason. Now, the fourth reason, and this is really the main thrust of the paper, I think. The fourth reason is this. So some people think that when they encounter these sort of revisionary pronoun rituals, when you're asked to share your pronouns or you're asked to use neo-pronouns or use pronouns in ways that don't track biological sex, a lot of people protest and think, well, I'm being asked to say something dishonest or I'm being asked to lie. And I'm not entirely convinced that that's true. I think that when you look at the intended meaning behind these words, when you look at what these groups intend to say with the words, often it's unobjectionable. So, for example, there are at least some people when they say trans women are women, what they really mean is something. What they intend to say is something like trans women have a gender identity of woman, which is just to say trans women believe that they're women or aspire to be women or desire to be women or something like that. And that intended meaning, the intended meaning is kind of objectionable or unobjectionable. You might object to the appropriation of the word woman, but the intended meaning you might think is unobjectionable. So when you're asked to participate in this revisionary language and this new way of speaking, I don't think that what you're being asked to intend with your words is false. So I don't, at least often. So I don't think that's going to be I don't think that's the right way to respond. I think rather the thing to say is this. Here's, I think, why people, deep down, this might be why people are objecting to it. This is why I object to it. So it is the case that many kinds of acts, including speech acts, can pragmatically convey approval or disapproval. So here's just kind of a ordinary, banal example, I guess. Somebody might ask you to attend their wedding, and by going, you're sort of communicating like support, right? And that's why. Unfortunately, sometimes if parents disapprove of the marriage, like they're torn about whether to attend the wedding or not, because they realize that just by being there, they will communicate approval. Here's an example where the stakes were even higher. So my understanding is that in feudal Japan, like between 1600 and the late 1800s, when Christianity was being persecuted in Japan, many people, maybe everybody, was asked to perform a certain kind of test, like once a year or something. And the test was to try to figure out who the Christians are. And the test was to require people to step on, at first it was paper or wood, then it became bronze, but it was an icon or an image of Jesus or Mary. And so the thought was like, we're going to require you to step on this. And I think they were called fumie. And so although these people weren't being asked to say anything, so no words were required, all that was required of you was a certain kind of act. And of course, the thought naturally was, if you perform this act, then what you're communicating is that you do not hold these images or what they're images of. You don't hold Jesus or Mary or other Christian figures in high esteem. You don't have great honor for them. You're willing to trample on images of them. Okay, so that's an example of how a certain kind of act can convey approval or disapproval. Okay, and so if you don't wish to convey that, then you have strong reason not to perform the action. And so many Christians abstained from trampling on the icons, from stepping on the icons. So yeah, again, so this is sort of similar to what's being asked in revisionary pronoun rituals. On the one hand, like what you're being asked to do is relatively minor as far as an act goes, right? Just being asked to share your preferred pronouns. Surely you have pronouns that you prefer, right? Why don't you share them with the group? This is just a piece of bronze with an image of it. Why don't you just step on it? That's not a big deal. You take steps all the time, right? Stepping on things is an ordinary part of your day. Why don't you just step on this bronze image? So yeah, the act that you're being asked to perform is like relatively unobjectionable. You're not being asked to say anything false or dishonest. You're not being asked to lie. In the case of fumie, you're not being asked to say anything. And yet still you're being asked to perform an act that I think would communicate approval or disapproval. Here's just one more example. So Muslims use the phrase, peace be upon him, after any mention of Muhammad. And they prefer to refer to him as the Prophet Muhammad because they think he was a prophet and was given words, given messages from God. They do this out of respect for Muhammad. They would be delighted and feel quite affirmed if non-Muslims would join in. But if I participated in that, what I would be conveying pragmatically is that I approve of or even adhere to Islam. But given that I believe Islam is false, I have strong reason not to signal approval or to participate in this way. I'm not a part of that religion. So why would I speak the way that they do? Yeah, even if, like, as a matter of fact, I do wish peace upon Muhammad. I wish peace upon everybody generally. It's quite common for Catholics to pray for the dead and pray that anytime you say rest in peace, that's sort of a little prayer that peace would rest upon this person. So even if I wish peace upon Muhammad, again, just participating in that practice would convey approval or even adherence to Islam, which I don't wish to do. Okay, so I think the same thing goes with pronoun use and contemporary gender ideology. When you're asked to participate in pronoun sharing rituals or to use she, her pronouns of males who believe that they're girls or women, or when you're asked to use neo-pronouns, you're being asked to perform an act that would pragmatically convey approval or even adherence, right? You're being asked to participate in a way that would signal your approval or adherence. And then you may have strong reason not to convey or signal that sort of approval or adherence. After all, this is an ideology on which womanhood and manhood are psychological phenomena. So determined by some psychological state of yours, some internal map that you were socialized to have, according to thinkers like Catherine Jenkins, or maybe your sincere self-identification, according to philosophers like Talia May Betcher. This is an ideology, as we've seen, with implications for social organization, sports teams, prisons, bathrooms, universities, these sorts of things, according to contemporary gender ideology, should be segregated not on the basis of sex, but on the basis of so-called gender identity. As we've seen, now it's almost 2025. I think it's pretty clear to everybody that this is an ideology with implications for the permissibility of certain medical interventions. For example, puberty blockers for children, surgical interventions for both children and adults. Here's another quotation from Robin Dembrov, who's a non-binary philosopher at Yale. Dembrov says, non-binary identity is an unabashedly political identity. It's an unabashedly political identity. So those who repudiate this political agenda have a strong reason not to convey approval or adherence to it by participating in these pronoun rituals. Okay, and now I'll just take a couple minutes to respond to an objection or two. So one reason is, look, if we continue to use pronouns in a way that tracks biological sex, this will not be very affirming, right? This will not be very affirming. So sex tracking fails to conform to people's preferred pronouns. And if you're wondering why is that bad, here's a quotation from E.M. Hernandez, who says, moral reasons to engage in acts that gender affirm derive from the commitment to give and express loving attention to trans people as a way of challenging their marginalization. So I think the general principle is, look, we should treat people how they wish to be treated. We should perceive people on their own terms, especially if they are marginalized in some way or oppressed. So that seems to be the thought. Just two quick responses. One is that, look, on the sex tracking view, pronouns, these third-person singular pronouns, are just communicating information about biological sex. So unless gender or gender identity just is biological sex, and I don't think these folks wish to say that it is, then pronouns on the sex tracking use of them are not gendering anybody. So for even stronger reasons, they're not misgendering anybody, right? Nobody's getting gendered at all. We're just tracking biological sex, which is real. Okay, so that's one response. Nobody's being gender affirmed or failing to be gender affirmed. There's just no information about gender being communicated. The second response is, nevertheless, I mean, you got to admit the sex tracking view is not using the pronouns that people would prefer, and that's right. So the sex tracking view does seem to fail to perceive some people on their own terms. But it is often permissible or even obligatory not to perceive people on their own terms. So one example that I thought of was Ollie London, who maybe you've seen on Twitter, some social media influencer person. Ollie London is very much a male of English ancestry, but for a time, several years ago, was identifying as non-binary, but also Korean, and wanted to use the pronouns like core/Ian or something like that, if I'm remembering correctly. So it's kind of interesting, like whenever he would announce this, he'd scroll through the comments, and many of his followers back then, like 5 years ago or something, would be totally fine with the non-binary identity part. They'd be like, yeah, sure, we got to respect that. We got to affirm you in that. But they balked at his claim that he was Korean. They said, okay, no, we can't affirm you in that. You're not Korean. So that might be an example in which you're permitted not to affirm somebody or see them as they wish to be seen. In fact, you might even be obligated not to. Another example is, again, the Muslims with peace be upon him. I don't doubt that many Muslims would find it affirming if I were to talk about the Prophet Muhammad and say peace be upon him. But I'm not obligated to do that because I think that's false. Okay, so I think those are two fine examples. And thanks again for your attention, and to Holly for inviting me to be a part of this.